topic which happens to be quite data related. It's a very important topic in a lot of modeling projects, including most of those that I MC. It's an area where our group tends to put a lot of emphasis and where we spend a lot of time. And that's this whole issue of dealing with what I call data gradients. Cases where we have sometimes data that can inform the quantities directly represented in the model. Parameter values, for example, we may have quantities, estimates for those. But often we'll have a lot more data that relates to model output. So, we may have data related to the emergent patterns of the system. We can't put that data into the model directly. The emergent patterns were built from the model. They're almost by definition, they're in no way programmed into the model. We don't have a representation that first day. That model, we didn't have a representation of that arc of expanding, of the wave of the expanding section in that space. It didn't have a representation that there's recovered people inside of infected people. That resulted from the model. And yet we may have data about those things. A lot of data that we gather in the empirical world concerns factors that are endogenous in our model, that are calculated by the model. We can't really force them onto the model. The model's generating them, it's running and it's computing them. How can we tell it, assume this? But what we can do is get the model to try to match that empirical data. So parameter values, things like the assumption about how much exposure to a park, living close to a park, might affect someone's physical activity level. That might be an example of a parameter. But what might be an example of an emergent pattern is the fact that those living near a park have lower BMI levels by 1 or 2 points than those living elsewhere. And there might be certainly exposure to parks in terms of physical activity might be one piece of that, but it might also reflect socioeconomic gradients and the fact that people live close to parks are those from wealthier backgrounds, and they're also more educated in terms of their nutrition, and they better access to grocery stores. And we can't simply force into the model this assumption that those who live near parks have lower BMI. That's something we want to explain with the model. That's something that we want the model to generate so we can ask what-if questions where we don't have empirical data, where we don't have statistical data to ground it. We want to go into a totally factual mode. So, we'll often have data that can't be directly put into the model, but the model needs to match it. Maybe the data isn't broken down in all the details that the model needs. Maybe it's about things that the model calculates. Now, there's 2 big ways we deal with this in models. The key factor here is that we're seeking our models to typically explain data across a wide variety of different outcomes. When we have these simulation models, running the model will simultaneously be calculating variables related to a variety of factors. This is from some work we've done. This actually from a system dynamics model related to type 2 diabetes and end-stage renal disease, as well as gestational diabetes. And we have empirical data shown in red and blue and green here. And then we have model-generated results shown in gray and red, for example. And what's notable is that, unlike, say, a logistic regression model, where we have one output variable, one dependent variable, or other types of statistical models where we're dealing with just a single dependent variable. Here we have a variety of variables that the model is calculating as part of its operation. It's actually got a representation of the population size and of the incidence of type 2 diabetes, and of the current prevalence of type 2 diabetes, and of ESRD prevalence, etc. And the model is generating all these things as part of its operation, and we would like the model to have safe plausibility as an empirically grounded model, we'd like it to simultaneously match time series or data points that we have across many different matches here. With an agent-based model, not only do we have the opportunity to match up cross-sectional data over time, as is shown here, but we have the opportunity to match up patterns in longitudinal data. And there's two general ways in which we can make use of sort of data that results from many factors. One of them is more classic, it's called backing out, and this involves taking data that we can't directly put into model and unpacking it a bit so that we can put it into model. But we generally won't undertake this for highly emergent data. We'll undertake this for data that just, in a very simple way, combines several factors that are in the model. And I won't go into this, but suffice it to say that sometimes you don't have data in quite the right form you'd like. You get it empirically, and by massaging it in the appropriate way, by making some simple assumptions, you can arrive at parameter estimates. I'm not going to really talk about that here. What I'm going to be talking about is calibration, which is, you could view as sort of triangulating from multiple data systems. In calibration, we're typically tuning values of model parameters. That's the term that's used in it, derived from engineering. We adjust parameter values that are less well known to best match some of the observable data. Now, here we're typically matching them to many time series or data points. And the idea is to get the calibration software, for example, AnyLogic offset calibration mechanism. What must these parameters be in order to explain different sources of data that I see simultaneously? I should note that I've spent quite a lot of time, and you'll find videos of me talking about the use of dynamic modeling with an alternative to calibration involving sequential Monte Carlo approaches and involving MCMC. So you should be aware that calibration is not the only game in town, but it's an extremely common process, and it's one that we've applied in many contexts. These days, we tend to be putting more emphasis on computational statistical approaches because of some shortcomings with calibration. But because this is so dominant, I wanted to provide you with some understanding of it. So here, we're typically matching observed data that the model is expected to try to generate. And critically, and this is one of the most important factors for calibration, you will often get into situations where the model just can't match the empirical data. When we're in those sort of situations, that's our attempt to learn from this and to further refine the model. So often this is a point of great learning for a model. We try to get it to match the data, it just doesn't fit. At a certain level it will be frustrating, but it's one of the greatest opportunities that we have to learn within our modeling process. It's a chance to be pointed out, your model just doesn't cut it, go back to the drawing board. And when we're trying to explain a bunch of different time series like this, we have a pretty high bar. We're trying to match several things, and if the model is off in some systematic way, often it just won't match these simultaneously. You'd like a balloon, you squeeze it here, you can match this one, but it won't match this one, and vice versa. A good model, a model that captures the underlying processes well, we'd expect it to match across a wide variety of time series. So a little bit on the how of how calibration is traditionally done. Bearing in mind that I also apply other approaches in computational stats that provide alternatives to it. In its traditional form, calibration uses a global optimization algorithm that adjusts unknown parameters so that the match between the model's output and the empirical data across many different types of variables matches as closely as possible. We're typically making use of some objective functions to measure how closely the two match. In other words, how big a discrepancy there is. And the optimization algorithm will run the model many, many times, adjusting parameter values to see if it can find the best fit, the least bad fit between the two. Okay? And there's some technical details to this I don't have time to go into. I was thinking of glossing over, but I'm happy to answer questions about. We're going to actually go through a little calibration exercise in just a few minutes with the modeling software, with AnyLogic, to see how this is done. Okay, AnyLogic has a quite sophisticated optimization algorithm based on genetic programming, I believe, and it's a genetic algorithm. But it's a quite sophisticated way of trying to adjust parameter values, recognizing that searching all possible parameter values is not possible. So in order to perform calibration, you have to tell it what do you want to match, how do you want to judge goodness of fit, and what parameters to vary, and over what range you want to vary them. And any further constraints associated with those parameters. For example, if they have to total up to something that's less than a certain value, or if one has to be greater than the other, etc. So you have to tell it sort of the constraints for the math for the optimization, and then tell it what to adjust, and then tell it what you want it to match and how you want it to match it, and sort of what's the measure of goodness of fit, and then you can set it off. So here we have some parameter space, maybe we have 3 parameters that we want to adjust, shown here in the axes, and it's going to be moving through space, trying to find the best assumption that assumes something about this parameter mu, something about this parameter beta, something about this parameter tau, such that the match of the model is as good as possible against the empirical data, according to the criteria we set. Okay, I don't think I'll go into details of this, but I think we'll actually go and open up a model, and we can see in front of us how some of this is going on. So I'd like you to open up a model that we loaded yesterday. It's called SIR agent-based calibration, for reasons that might have been obscure yesterday, but will soon be elucidated. So we're going to open it up. How do we open it up? Let me close it so that you can follow along this easily, because you might not have it open. So you do help example models, and it's actually listed there. Oh, remember in AnyLogic you could double click on one of these tabs to make it full screen? I'm going to double click on this just to make it easy for me to find, and I click down, go down here until I find SIR agent-based calibration. I don't have to do anything over here, just SIR agent-based calibration, okay? And it will take care of loading it in. This was actually the model we saw yesterday. We were looking at the parameter variation experiment for it. But today, we'll look at this calibration experiment. A calibration experiment is one of those types of experiments that AnyLogic support as a standard experiment type. You'll notice it down here. So here we're using an optimizer to find parameter values that find the best match, okay? And we'll operationalize those notions here. Yeah. Sure. Sure. Okay. So help example models, and again, I'm gonna you may need to make this a full screen by double clicking on that tab, and I'm not clicking on anything here. I'm just scrolling down here on the right hand side and selecting it. But if you do click over here on the left hand side, I believe if you did and you don't know where to find it, I believe you click on this examples at the top, and that will allow it'll be in that list that's shown. Any,
is it possible that you would have SIR and you have agent-based method?
okay, TA, could you help with this? So okay, so who else is having this problem? So Kurt, it should be under examples. Sometimes it's in 2 columns. Yeah. Okay. Good. Okay. So here we are. You're all set. Okay. Anyone else need help with that? Okay. Thanks, Kurt. Okay. So within this context, we're going to be running this calibration experiment. As I noted, that was one of the standard types of experiments. Let me close out these things so we don't distract us. We're not dealing with clinic flow in this model.
So I'm going to close this out. This is the same model we dealt with yesterday, dealt with the first day, in the sense of, we have a representation of people interacting in a space and contacts occurring between people that can transmit some contagion, and the people embedded in a 2D space. Let's look at the calibration experiment, though, in particular. This is new to us.
At a certain high level, well, let me state this. The calibration experiment is very similar in one regard to the parameter variation experiment. Well, two regards. One thing is it adjusts parameter values. The second thing is it runs the model many, many, many times. It runs main, which we used to think is kind of the overarching thing in a model. It runs this many times over, maybe thousands of times in a given calibration. Okay. And it is varying parameter values. But here it's varying parameter values to try to find the best match that minimizes this objective one. You notice minimize because you say minimize it. And the difference from sensor takes a sum of squares associated with difference between what the model produces and some historic data.
So let's explore this model a little bit so we could see how to unpack this. The first thing I'd like to explore is running the model. You'll notice that the model runs from time 0 to time 200, and I'd like to run the model and see basically what it's doing, and we'll figure out then how it works, okay? So if you go to run it, you'll notice that there's historic data plotted down here in the lower graph. This is some historic time series to which we have recourse. And we're going to run the model, and you'll see the model running many, many times over in this model. It'll be running the model notably
for different parameter values, but within a set of parameter values, within the same parameter assumption, it will run the model many times. Why is that? Can anyone advance an idea? Why is it for the same set of parameter values,
for the same sort of point within this space?
Why is it same assumptions about u, beta, and tau? Why would it run the model many times? Anyone? It's random. It has to. Maybe it was just a fluke. The first time you ran it, it matched really well with historic data. Maybe the next time it will match poorly. Maybe it exhibits wide varieties of behavior. So you got to run it many, many times. Many, many times over.
And you'll see it running many times, and then it will summarize the best output for a given value of the parameters, and that will involve a sum over various particular runs. So let's run this. Boom. See it up here giving the current assumption about parameter values, and here it's already found one that's a pretty good match to this. But it's trying again and again. It's adjusting these parameters. See them being adjusted here, and it's adjusting them and trying to find better and better matches to the data. Now, each of these blue ones is from a particular run of the model. Notice it's running versions of my models in my different so-called cores here over and over again. The red is representing the best set of parameter values, the average across those different parameter values, and it's trying to find an even better match. You'll notice some of them are quite close, some of them are quite far off. And over time, it's going to be getting closer and closer in its ability to match. So if we were to run this out for, it very quickly actually got down here, improved it a little bit there, it improved it a little bit just now. It's getting closer and closer. This is sort of showing for each set of parameter values how good a fit was it. And it's gone through now about 100 different sets of parameter values, and it's finding successively better outputs over time. So here we have a single data source, and it's matching it, a single set of a single time series. Now, as part of my exercises for the boot camp,
as part of my challenges for the boot camp, I gave two sets of exercises for the boot camp. One set is for those teaching a step-by-step guide, what you would do this, build up the model, give you a bit of confidence. The the other set are what I call challenges. And these are more open-ended exercises where I don't give you the exact answer, but where you can engage with it and try to solve the problem. And for one of those, and honestly I can't remember if it was in the challenges or the step-by-step tutorials, I have one where you elaborate this to match up many time series and have you experiment with it. In any case, what we're seeing is that over time it's matching this historic output more closely, and it's getting progressively less of a distance, a discrepancy is measured by the metric used here. So we're going to go, having seen this, and gotten the basic idea that the model is trying to match by running again and again and again, trying to match this short time series, and it's remembering the best one, and it's going to use that. This is the best one thus far. We're now going to go see how this works. Okay, we're going to unpack it and see how the model basically functions.
How would you adapt this to your model? Sure. Parameters. Yeah. That's right.
That's right. And hence, another motivation for kind of thinking through those intermediate pathways, because you would have a further capacity to kind of vary your assumptions about those pathways, how they might be operating in your particular context via calibration. And it's notable that this process, by allowing you to adjust these assumptions, one of the important areas where you might adjust those assumptions are for variables that are hard to measure. You give only a rough sense of how they might be operating, and so those will be often strong targets for calibration. Calibration processes of these sorts are routine within the modeling space. That's not to say universal. You will find models where they've been able to pin things down to empirical data well enough that they haven't needed those. But they're very common, particularly for parameters that are latent, not directly observable, that are underdocumented, and we adjust those parameters and see, does the model add up in terms of its ability to explain things where we do know the situation, where we do have empirical data, is it able to match those patterns? So a very important question, when you have empirical data, as I know a lot of you do for problems of interest, a very important question that I like to ask when I see this empirical data, or I like to think about it, is this data, the type of data you can put into the model directly, data about the micro behavior as depicted in the model, or is it data that the model should explain? The model should try to replicate, the model should be plausible, to have face validity, to pass the red face test, that needs to match this data. That's two different types of data, and by getting clarity on which type of data is which, you could save yourself some grief sometimes. There's some data that we work with, we initially thought we could put into the data. An example would be with that PD model. We have data from contact tracing, and we said, we can put this into the model. Doesn't work. That data is from a process. It's generated by the contact tracing process. If the contact tracing process was sane, that empirical data would look very different. So instead of putting it into the model as the assumption about network structure, we have to have the model match that data. We have to have the model explain the features of the data, stay true to the data, be consistent with the data. So that's an example of something initially we said, great, we'll put it into the model. And then we sat back and thought about this. No way we could put this into the model. It's something that results from the sort of processes we got represented in the model. We have to have it match it to make use of it. It can still constrain the model, it can still inform the model, but it informs it by sort of constraining the possible parameter values that you're considering. And generally, often there's very little wiggle room. That once you've got this different types of data surrounding the model, you can only have so many small range of parameter value variation without violating the match, the goodness of fit to some of that data. So often it can be a quite effective way of constraining the model. there are identifiability issues here. Like in statistics, if we have very few points of data and we have many things we're trying to calibrate, there's going to be many matches that match those two data points. So identifiability is just as big in MCT as it is in statistics in general. And fortunately, we tend to deal with areas that in many cases are fairly data rich, and so we can bring many data points to the problem. And we may be dealing with calibration of one or two dozen parameters in cases where we have a lot of calibration data. That's a high number of things being calibrated, but we have enough data points that collectively constrain it that we can still get consistent bits that aren't underdetermined, that don't you can't calibrate it to the same value with lots and lots of different things. Okay, so let's go see how this works with your leave. So we're going to go in here, and I'd like you to go click on the calibration experiment, and you'll notice that it says stop after 500 iterations here, so we can actually specify what are the criteria for stopping. People in my group have been known to run these things for a day, possibly longer. I've been known to do that. Sometimes while I go give talks at conferences, my machine is punching away. Sometimes it's this MCMC things with dynamic models, sometimes it's with calibration. Here, so this is telling how many runs you want to do. How long do we want to spend exploring the space? Here, we're saying, okay, vary these parameters and vary them over this list. Okay? And then we have here, okay, this automatic stop, this arrow is misplaced. This automatic stop. I should say this, in the experiments in general, there's a thing called maximum available memory. Sometimes you'll notice on the lower right-hand corner of AnyLogic, you'll get this thing flashing up in red, and that shows it's memory constrained, in which case you can make this larger. I should have mentioned that. Sometimes if things go really, really slow, you can increase that amount of memory. I'll sort of show it. I should have mentioned that it's a practical matter, and occasionally you'll see me tweak that. But down here, you'll sometimes see it's not here. It's in this other area. You'll see it turning red like that, and that's a sign that if it does this a lot, if it does it like half the time or more, then I would say you might want to give it more memory. In any case, here we have this point. This should point to automatic stop. You can set criteria for it to sort of stop automatically based on some criteria. Perhaps the most important function conceptually here is the objective function. Here we're making use of the difference function, which is specifying a sum of squares type difference. If we go back to to the model here, we can look it up. So this difference function. This is a function which is used to compute the discrepancy. So it's the square root of the average of the square difference between a linearly interpolated data set, that's this one here, and this is the data set we collected from the model. It linearly interpolates it in this table function. Let's go see where this table function came from. DS infection historic. That is actually defined here. So basically when this runs, we fill up DS infection, it's a data set, and we fill it up from this thing called infection historic. Let's go see what that is. This is a data source. So we can go here and expand calibration, and we'll see there's this thing here called infectious historic under functions.
and you'll notice this is the source of the data that we're trying to match. Okay, so you could wiggle it around if you want to, and try to match that instead. For example, if I wanted to, I could move these data points. The data points are defined up here, but I could move it so that, at time 20, it was significantly lower, something like this, and it would update it accordingly. So here we are in the calibration. We're seeking to match as closely as possible this historic data, which has come from this data set, which we just looked at, or this table function, this thing that specifies for this time, it should be this value. We're trying to match that to this thing called DS infectious current. Okay, so AnyLogic, it's a good question. AnyLogic has this notion, which I must say is very helpful, of being able to define a function, not only in terms of algebraically, or in terms of code, but also in terms of data. So given this time, what is the corresponding number of people infected? So it's a map from this to this. So at time 10, 20, on 10, you have 202 people infected. At time 12, plus 68. So it's called a table function because it simply involves a tabular sort of lookup, and here we say it's linearly interpolated or spline interpolated, or it's a step function, for example, this sort of step function, etc. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Perfect. Interpolated. That's right. Or use spline interpolation, which involves a function and interpolation, etc. So basically, it's a way to sort of graphically define an empirical function of from some data points to some results. So this could be BMI, this could be age, and this could be recommended BMI level, or obesity threshold by the WHO guidelines at different ages, or this could be mean caloric intake for different BMI levels. You could specify this sort of table function, which is just capturing your empirical data. Does that make sense? You don't have to worry about it. It'll take care of turning this into something you could just say, what is the value of this function at, 27, and it will do it. If you had BMI here, you might specify again, mean caloric intake for BMI or caloric expenditure for different size BMI. And then you may only specify this at every, 2 BMI levels, but you could ask at BMI 20.5, what's caloric expenditure? If it's interesting. Well, yeah, I mean, you could tell what sort of interpolation you perform. Yeah, it just returns, the step would be, it returns, this value for subsequent data points up to this value. Yeah. Yeah. No, it doesn't. I'll further elucidate that. So this difference here, it's taking the difference between two what we call data sets. AnyLogic has these constructs defined that are called data sets, and we actually saw this at one point briefly. But the idea is that these data sets, you can, if you have a data set in your model here, and I'll just go select this one. Say this one, DS infectious historic, because it's tied with the questions here. Here, this is a data set that will contain the data in that table function, okay, as a function of time. This data set, often these data sets are functions of time. This data set, DS infectious current. This will contain the data actually collected by our model. So, because we're trying to match, ladies and gentlemen, our model predictions, this one, with what the historic data tells us. And so this data set, DS infectious current, is going to be coming from our model. And the way in which that will happen, Ben, is that in this experiment, what's going to happen every time it runs our model, and it is going to, after it runs the model, after the model is complete, it's going to run main. It's going to go say, these are your parameters, go do your business, and main will run, and main will finish. Main is going to be running along, it's going to be accumulating data on the number of infected people over time, right? And why is it collecting data on that? Because that's what we want to compare with. That's what we want to compare with the historic data. So main is going to be running. It's going to be putting its data in this data set here, and we're going to be retrieving that data and putting it into our data set in the experiment. And then that will allow us to compare it against the historic data. Does that make sense? Yeah. You'll find videos of me online where I explain this in a lot more detail in a step-by-step fashion, but I'm trying to hit on the sort of high-level points here. Let's go find where this is computed. This root is main. So basically from main, after main has finished, after the simulation run is complete, main has done its job. It's completed running. It's got the data set. We can go accumulate, and up in main, let's go down main. And here we go. Here, this infectious DS, this is something that every 2 time units, we're getting the value of this number of infectious people. It could have been just as easily, we could have done population or people, called people.count infected. That would have been equally good. Remember we did this before? We defined statistics in here. We called the statistics for that graph. We could do the same thing, type of thing here. We define over there. But it has to do with a variable, which is fine. For didactic reasons, I would do it the other way. In any case, so main runs, this is main, it runs, it accumulates in this data set the number of people infected over time. Let's run, well, I'll go do this. I wouldn't do this yourself, but if you want to, you're welcome to follow along. Here's a regular experiment. I just added a regular experiment. Let's go run main. Watch this. I'm going to run main. Here it is. It's running. Boom. I can go click here. This is my data. That's the data it accumulated while it was running on the number of infectious people. Okay? I can go see a graph of it. That's the number of infectious people over time. This is just a single run of main. Having done that, I can copy this, by the way, to Excel directly. But what's going on in this particular calibration experiment is it's taking that data and it's putting it in to this DS infectious current, which it has around, because main is going to go away. Main is going to be regenerated and used to run again and again and again. So we have this thing, DS infectious current, which is our data set, and calibration is going to compare the data from main with the data from the historic data, that thing in the table function we just saw, this guy here. It's going to compare those two. It's going to take the mean squared difference, the square root of the sum of squared difference. And that's going to be used to then evaluate the goodness of fit here. It's going to be used to evaluate whether it's a good match or not a good match. And it's going to do it 500 times. Is that helpful? So it's running this thing 500 times. Okay, it's running it basically 500 different parameter values. Now, for each of those parameter values, it is using 5 replications. In other words, it's running, and this is important then, it's actually running for each assumption of parameter values, it's running it 5 times for reasons that were mentioned earlier. Because
if it just ran it once, it might by fluke have a great match for the data source. So it runs it 5 times for each assumed parameter value. So for a particular value of data, of mu and tau, or whatever your parameters are, it'll run it 5 times and take the mean of the objective function and use that as the goodness set for those things. Does that help?
So if we wanted to match more than one time series, yeah. Yeah. That's exactly right. That's right. It's in a data set in there, yeah. Correct. Correct. Main is going to be salvaged. We salvage the data from it just before it disappears.
Main, we tell main to run, it does its job, it's going to disappear, we salvage the data from it, copy it to a safe place, which is in our own data set, and then we can compare it with it. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Those are subtle matters that we do with the plumbing. At a high level, what it's doing is kind of match the data from that's generated by the model to the system. That's right. But the plumbing side is important if you want to do this for your own experiment to know what's going on. I would just note that if we wanted this to match, right now we're matching a single set of historic data, single time series. If you want to match several, you just add these into this function here. And when you run main, you'd have to salvage, read it out to main, read it out to main, read that out to main, or what do I, and then you can compare it to the historic time series. Does that make sense? No, because, it's a good question. This is the number of infected people. This,
I should have changed the name. This might be, number of, this might be prevalent cases. This might be, yeah, that's right. So this might be, incident case count, and we'd match that against a corresponding historic data set. This might be, deaths, new deaths or something like that from the model, and we match that against new deaths historically. Does that make sense? Yeah, so something along those lines.
Can you go over simplification of this variance?
Sure. This comparison? This one here? Sure. Sure. So are you comfortable with the fact this is historic data? This is data that we've gotten there. And this is a built-in function that AnyLogic provides. You can define your own function. You could have, my difference function. If you want to have your own custom function, you could do that. This happens to be one that AnyLogic provides, and it's defined in the documentation here. And you notice it's the square root of the average of the square difference between linear interpolated data set and the table function.
Well, here's one, and this we're using the second one.
So there's two variants of the method. Thank you for catching that. There's two variants of it. One that takes two data sets, and one which takes a data set with data.
So here we have something along these lines. If you have n, so if you have n data points, the square of the difference is the average of the square of the difference. Okay. So this might be the historic data, and this is the data from the model. And we take the difference, we square it, we divide it by the number, so I here varies between, so I varies between 1 and n, with n data points, and we take the square root of it. So this is beer crunch. So, I think for no good. I guess I'm now gonna eat healthy. Sorry, so yes, you can define your own section. Yeah, you can find your own function. This is just after P1 that provides that as default. It's a common. Oh, you want multiple parameters that you want to adjust? If you want to adjust multiple parameters, you'll be adjusting them while matching to a given set of data. So if you add in another parameter to adjust, putting aside identifiability concerns, if you add another parameter to adjust, you don't have to go add directly. There's nothing that forces you to add more data to compare to which to compare. In other words, so let's put it this way. Maybe I'm misunderstanding your question, but let's look at this. Let's run this thing here. So here I am adjusting two parameters here, right? I could add a third parameter to adjust, and I could still match against the same data set, the same set of empirical data, the same set of historic data as shown here. But there's a limit to how many parameters I can add for identifiability reasons. At a certain point, it'll become underdetermined, like what, I could match it with this set of data, this set of parameter values, to this set, because there's so much wiggle room. I'm speaking, in a very informal way here, but it's the same sort of identifiability type of issues that come up with statistical models. And so if we have many data points, we may be able to comfortably add several more parameters. On the other hand, if we have few data points, adding more parameters will in general muddy the water for estimating those first couple parameters. But in general, we can add additional parameters to adjust. We can go up to here and say we want to adjust additional parameters, not just these two, but additional ones without terrible problems. Does that make sense? Like, I don't know. I mean, if I were to go add this guy in as something that I want to adjust, between, what's that? 10 and 20. Good. Average illness duration between this, and it's continuous. So you can either choose continuous or discrete. Discrete will have a certain step size, presumably you have to specify, whereas continuous you don't need to specify that. I would imagine that it'll probably work. I've tried this before, but I'm not running the right thing here. Sorry. Phone out there. So here are three things to adjust. Let's run a calibration experiment. Boom. And it won't actually print them out just because it's being told to print them out, but it's adjusting now all three. Does that make sense? The historic data, to be clear, the parameters are things that contribute. So the historic data contains things that we can't put directly into model testing. It contains things that correspond to emergent behavior of the model. In this case, it's the number of infectious people. Now that number of infectious people, by the way, look how it's changed the pattern. It's kind of interesting. That number of infectious people, where does that result from? Does it result from this parameter or that parameter or that parameter? Well, you tell me. Does the number of infectious people over time in this model, does it result from this parameter alone? No. Does it result from this one alone? Does it result from this one alone? No, it doesn't. It results from all of them. It's some complex nonlinear interaction of all of them. That's why it's a simulation model here. It's a nonlinear simulation model. In general, we can't write down exactly how it depends, but we know it depends on
we can't write down a closed form statement of how it will change over time, but it depends on all three, because all three determine people's interactions and so on. So we're changing parameter values here, and then as a result, the model exhibits behavior over time. It exhibits data in terms of the number of infectious people over time. Let's run this. Boom. This is what, that's interesting. None. Okay, well, I'll be. Okay, here we go. I guess that was a chance thing. It just died out.
Here's the number of infected people over time. This is an emergent pattern from the model. It results from all three parameter values. All three parameter values have contributed at some level to this. And therefore, if we wanted to try to get it to match values, if we wanted to try to judge what the most plausible values are for those parameter values, if we didn't have data to really ground the estimates from those parameter values, we could ask it, hey, go try to match up, the best fit of the model against this for different parameter values. Now, and it could arrive at some estimate. Now, there's a set of additional checks you want to do when undertaking this. It's not merely mechanical exercise. Calibration is one of the most sort of tricky things that you're doing, in the sense that when you run it, you want to make sure that this is really, there's a really a best match. It's not merely with a wide range of possible matches. Sometimes you get long, things where, well, you could have A lower and B higher, or vice versa, and it's really the product of them which matters. And so you want to do a fair bit of experimentation with calibration, not just simply assume that the best is the only one. It may not be the unique one. And there are tools that we've created and that others have contributed to help try to assess that. But the point is that you can try to find, with the same historic data set, you could try to find the values, estimate the values for additional parameters as part of that. Does that help? Yes. Okay. So in this particular interface, these are good questions. In this particular interface here, we are actually, they've set up this example, such that I'm going to switch this back. They've set up this example to actually show over time the best one here. So this is kind of the best one at which it's arrived right now. And there's a bit of kind of plumbing to make that happen in terms of the interface. All these interfaces, are things you can build. There's nothing, it's not like they've done something special to build this. These are things you can go add to models. And there's a bit of finesse they use to do this particular one. But it's things you could do if you had several parameters. You could print out what is the best value. Or, alternatively, as Ben has asked before, you could get it to, dump all the data out, out externally, and you could actually use an external program, some analysis software to try to arrive at what you believe is the best value. So it doesn't have to be trapped in AnyLogic, but in this case, you can fairly readily get it to sort of tell you, okay, what's the best one so far? Does that make sense? Okay, good. Okay, so calibration is a process that involves some plumbing and involves some subtleties. Be aware that in this case we are running the model many times because there's stochastic people here. You can't just run it once and say, oh, it's a great fit. Well, yeah, it might have been because of just dumb luck and with this set of parameter values, and it may be that the next set of parameter values is even better, but because of bad luck, it didn't actually work. So we need in general to run these many replications, and hence this thing here where we can say use replications and the number of replications we want to use.
Okay. Whoa. Okay. So let me get this back. I'm gonna have to close on this soon. We've covered this. We could tell it to stop based on some statistical criteria having to do with confidence intervals, taking the means of the replication values. And I don't have time to go into this, but there is this statistical criteria that you could use to based on the width of the error bars to sort of stop when they reach a certain level of narrowness, and it's selected in this varying number of replications. There may be a statistical assumption there that's used when you're taking the mean that it's normally distributed with enough values added up, but I'd have to go back and check that. And I've provided some ways of sort of getting some extra output of what's going on. So, generally, the more data you can bring to bear, the more empirical data, you can enhance the identifiability. Adding parameters to tune leads to a larger space to explore. Too many parameters to tune can lead to an underdetermined situation. And all fits, very importantly to the question in the back there, all fits are within the constraints of the model. So we're doing this, we're finding the best fit for this model. If you want to try to do model selection, it's outside the calibration process. Now, as I said, calibration is one of those places where you learn the most about a model, and you learn where it doesn't add up. It just doesn't add up. I mean, here, I wouldn't follow me in this, but let me just show an example here. I'm going to modify this, and hopefully the TAs can help make me remember not to save this model. So I'm just going to delete these things. I'm deleting the values from this thing to match. And what I'm going to do is to have this go up to a value have a very different type of curve. I'm going to have it perform an S curve here, to a sigmoidal type curve. What's that? I can make it bimodal. It's true. I could make any number of different things where it's just not going to add up. Okay, there we go, and I'm going to have at time 200, it's going to be, 6,000 or something like that. Okay, and I'm going to tell it go figure. Oh, I saved it. Oh, great. Okay, that now makes 3 points in my life where I regret having saved. Oh, great. Okay, maybe 4. Okay, so I must have added the wrong number of points. How many points does this data set have? Sorry, could someone tell me? I boxed myself in a corner here. How many points does this data set have on your thing? What's the maximum number here? Is it 200? Okay. Oh man. Maybe I have to do 20, 6,000, 20. No, I hope not. Okay, I may have to abandon this quest, like Don Quixote. But I was hoping to do this. It may be counting on the number of items in there to show it. Okay, there's no data item. Okay, yeah. Yeah, there may be something going on with that. My guess is that it has to have the same number of data points, but that shouldn't be a problem. Okay, well, I will abandon that link. Okay, and the TAs can help me repair the model. Oh, yeah, that might be. Let's go see. That would be very nice, but I have my doubts if I saved it. Oh. To a point. Okay. Okay. Yeah. To a point. I'm gonna need TA help later. Okay. Okay, so learning, you can learn from your calibration. If it doesn't add up, there's a reason for it. This is an opportunity to learn, and there's a set of tips for doing this well. You can really learn a lot from a case where it doesn't add up. If it's not jibing with the data, it's going to tell you something often, and you can run the model with different constraints in place. You can run the model with different constraints in the parameters. You can test the model manually with different parameter values, and associate different weights with the different data to match, and find an explanation, get a good feel intuitively for why it's not matching. And that can allow you to improve your model or to identify problems with the data. There's been a number of times in my professional life, there's been a lot of times in my professional life where I've tried to match historic data, failed to do so, and it's caused a very material improvement in the model as a result. I've gotten a real insight from that. I've gone back, thought things through, and improved the model, and benefited from that. There's also, and this is a warning, there's also times in my life where I've been unable to match the data, and I've struggled, and I have found out later, a little bit to my chagrin, that actually the problem is with the data. I remember several points where I only discovered after the fact that from beating my head against the wall with this model, trying to get it to calibrate, and just not able to do it, where I've gone and found out more about the data set, and particularly found that the definition changed for the group that it doesn't match. So in other words, the data, I thought the data was using a consistent definition over all of the time points. It was in fact changing the definition for different years that had different definition of what constituted a kindergarten, or what constituted TB. So they changed the definition for certain years, and those were the years I was having trouble. Went back and fixed that, and found that the math to be far more effective. So there are times where calibration will suggest data problems for you, and you should be aware that it's sometimes a problem with the model, it's sometimes a problem with the data, and you also have to look for cases where it seems good, but there's many. It's in fact not. It's not unique in it. The calibrated values are not particularly unique. So I have a bunch of suggestions, in terms of calibration, ways of dealing with uniqueness issues, constraints, etc. There's a set of kind of best practices for doing calibration, which people have written on, and suggestions in the modeling literature that are fairly well articulated. Okay. Right. I think because of the strictures of time, I'm going to have to stop my discussion of calibration there, and I welcome any questions before moving on to a different topic. I wish I could give additional lectures related to our work more recently with using computational statistics as an alternative, approaches as an alternative to calibration, because I think they're very promising, but that would require a whole other level of sort of discussion. So, any questions? Okay. So TAs, please help me over lunch prepare that model. Okay, so we're going to go close that out then, and I think I'll move on to a different topic.